Welcome to the Stewardship Leader Podcast, brought to you by the Christian Stewardship Network. At CSN, we teach church leaders the biblical perspective on finances so they can speak with authority, confidence, and integrity. Our vision is to see a stewardship and generosity ministry in every church. You can learn more at christianstewardshipnetwork.com. Well, hey everyone, welcome to Stewardship Leader. I'm your host, Leo Sabo, and today I have the pleasure of having two individuals with me that I think you will really benefit from their perspective. We have Dwayne McNally from Mortarstone with us, and we also have Ron Sellers. He is with Gray Matter, and he does some research on giving that I think you guys will find very interesting. And so I want to just welcome both of you for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Leo. Really appreciate it and looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, let's start with Ron. Ron, would you introduce yourself? Let us know what research you do. Tell us about your expertise and really your perspective on giving, so important to us. So we want to know more about what you do and just introduce yourself in any way. Anything else you want to add, you're welcome to do so.
Basically, I have been in the consumer insights industry for more years than I will care to admit. I've worked with Disney, the US Army, Coca-Cola, General Motors, etc. But much of my career, I've specialized in working with nonprofit organizations, ministries, parachurch ministries, churches, denominations, etc. And it's a concentration on the faith-based side. And in fact, the slogan of Gray Matter Research is a passion for research that makes a difference. And so that's one of the things we're trying to do. You know, I can always help somebody sell more chocolates or sell more dish soap. But if I can do work that is getting children fed, that is spreading the gospel, that is doing things like that, that's always been a preference. And so we basically try and provide information that gets people thinking, that gets people to use it in their strategies, to hopefully think a little bit differently. And we concentrate on what our donors or Christians or whomever the target audience is. We concentrate on what are they thinking, what are they feeling, how do they perceive things, what's going on in their lives. And so we then try to provide that to either an individual client who's trying to answer those questions with very things that are very specific to their organization, or with some of our non-proprietary research, we simply do the research and we give it out free to whomever can use it.
That's perfect. Well, great. So grateful that you're bringing in this perspective because, as you know, our focus has been the church and givers in general, but obviously our focus has been how do we guide those who are part of our congregations in giving, both to the church but nonprofits, and obviously that's two different connected sectors, but totally different organizations that are being supported by evangelicals. So we want to really understand how your research, what you're finding out, what's really going on. So kind of let's dig into that. What is the role of the data research that you've done, and how does that help churches?
Well, and we're not the only ones providing information that can benefit the church. I mean, you've got others such as Pew Foundation, which does some terrific work, Lifeway Research, et cetera. But Gray Matter Research provides a lot of information that's freely available to ministry leaders, church leaders, congregants, whomever wants to use it. And we really love when leaders will use some of our research to break some stereotypes. There are a lot of stereotypes in the church. There are a lot of assumptions about how people give, why people attend church, what they're looking for, how they came to Christ, etc. And so sometimes our research really breaks through stereotypes and says, you know, all those assumptions that you've had, they may not be exactly accurate. So, or they may have changed with a new generation. And we love it when it gets leaders thinking and strategizing. You know, we see all the time interesting tidbits and interesting facts, and they're just interesting. That's all the value they have, right? What we really want is when people will say, well, now that's interesting. What should I do about it? How should I change my thinking? Should I change my thinking? How should it affect what I'm doing or what I should be doing in the future? And so we love to provide research that starts conversations. One of my favorite emails I've ever gotten from a pastor said, requested yet another, he's requested a bunch of our studies, requested yet another study. And he said, anytime I get this report, I send it out to all of my staff, and then we have a meeting saying, okay, what should we do about this? To me, that is an ideal use of what we do, what others in our area do, and even from secular sources, to help leaders understand what's going on in the world out there.
Very good. All right, Dwayne, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, and Leo, I know when I met Ron and started getting some of his data right away, we had just recently last year we had launched our first annual report, and where we were doing some analysis and seeking to understand what was going on with givers in the church from our view. And then I started getting Ron's data, and it supported and collaborated, but also went beyond a lot of the data that we have. And so one of the things I love about what Ron's doing is, as I take a look at what I see with givers in the church, and Ron's looking at NPO givers, nonprofit givers, we see correlations, but we also see some differences. And so, really digging into those conversations has been extremely valuable for me. And every time he sends out a report, almost soon I see it, I say send it, and then I send it on to a bunch of other people because the data is so valuable. And I know one of the things that we keep trying to look at Mortarstone is the fact of, it's really easy to see what we provide as the dashboard, the static information about where you stand to empty. And I think what Ron said about creating the conversations and building strategies around that actually is more like the miles to empty conversation, which is actually more valuable in my car than the actual gas gauge is. And so, how do we do that to create conversations, to build strategies on, okay, in 20 miles I need to get more gas, as opposed to just looking at it and saying, okay, how many more miles can I actually get on a half tank of gas? And so, moving through that lens is why I love and have enjoyed getting to know Ron and his research.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate both of you and the work that you're doing, because the information and the data that's coming across from the research you're doing, the reports that you're running, does help us as the church leaders involved in both ministering to people, but also helping people to understand giving. Giving is constantly changing. How we communicate about it is changing. I really want to hear a lot from Ron and from you, Dwayne, on what you guys are finding out. How does that help us then to kind of reshift our thinking and our approach in how we communicate on generosity? So tell us about the type of research that you're doing and why it's important.
Well, we're looking at a variety of different topics. We partner with a number of different agencies that serve the church, that serve parachurch ministries, individual denominations, etc. And so, for instance, one study that we just recently released is a repeat of a study that we did in the data was gathered late 2020, and the report was issued in early 2021. And it was in partnership with Infinity Concepts, which is based out of Pennsylvania. They work with many different Christian organizations. And we looked at giving among evangelical Protestants. And we saw a substantial decrease from late 2020 to the very early parts of 2024. And we gathered the data uh, basically across the board. Virtually every type of evangelical, whether it's men, women, rich, poor, older, younger. I mean, there was a decline across the board in all of their giving, in whether they're giving to church, whether they're giving to ministries or charities outside of the church, and then how much, if they are giving, how much they're giving to each one, and how generously. We measure generosity as the amount of money they give compared to their household income. That's a little bit of an estimate because in a survey, somebody's not going to tell us, well, last year I made $56,328.12, right? So, we ask the figures in $10,000 increments that will take the midpoint of that. So there's a little bit of play in the figures, but it proves pretty true over and over again when we compare it to other data that's out there. And so, first of all, one of the things we found, and this is no surprise, but a significant portion of evangelical Protestants basically don't give. 61% of all evangelical adults made a financial donation to a local church in the 12 months prior to the study. That's the most recent data. 50% gave to an organization outside of church, 31% didn't give a penny to either one. Now, they may have volunteered their time, they may have been in church leadership, they may have given used clothing to Salvation Army, something like that, but they're not giving money. And so it's a little ironic when we talk about there's so much focus in churches on tithing, and yet the proportion of evangelicals who give anything even close to a tithe is about 1 out of 10. And so you saw in the data, we saw a substantial drop across the board. The proportion giving to a church fell from 74% in late 2020 to 61% in early 2024. The proportion giving to a nonprofit or ministry outside of church fell from 58% to 50%. The proportion giving to neither one went from 19% to 31%. And it was interesting, Lifeway Research just came out with a study that showed that pastors, I believe it was 67% of all pastors, said the current economic conditions have had a negative impact on their church, which is a substantial increase in what they've seen. And the proportion who said the economy's had a very negative impact on their church is at the highest level since they've been doing this in the past 15 years. So again, it's always good, and Dwayne and I have talked about this separately. It's always good when you can see correlating and corroborating data that says, yeah, we're on the right track. We see this as accurate. And then the proportions that they are giving have gone down substantially as well. The level of generosity, and it wasn't that high to begin with.
And Leo, as we've talked through our annual report from Mortarstone, almost what Ron said, what we see is based upon within our system, we take census data and we can do that and then compare versus someone's giving. And our average amount was, I believe, like 8.6% of the people were tithing. That was of the givers, not of the entire church. And so you couple that with the 61% only that give, the average church has about 6% of their people are actually tithing based upon our data as well. And so it's supported by that. And we can take a look at what's happening with giving it with generations and everything else, and it all points to what's Ron's data, our data all points to the same thing: is that as Ron said, the conversations about tithing in the church is not actually making the inroads that I believe we all want to have take place. And so, how do we better engage the people who aren't giving, to the people who begin their giving journey, to helping people actually grow as givers, is something that is absolutely key, and that's something that we're passionate about at Mortarstone, as you know. So that's something that we want to help figure out how to address.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is definitely not good news, but it's important that we know it. So I appreciate you guys bringing this up and talking about it, and the research that you do and the information you gather, because it does tell us, hey, this is what's coming. And I don't, I mean, I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and I know that the figure of the people that were tithing was somewhere, and this is going back maybe 15, 20 years when I first started working in this ministry, but the figure was somewhere between 15, 10 to 15, maybe 20, 25% max were tithing. And now to really see the numbers be way, way lower. And I don't, does the data that you guys are finding, does that point to a reason for some of this? I don't know if that's not something that you really focus on, but what are your thoughts on, or what are some of the other key findings that can help us understand the reason behind what's going on with givers?
Well, we gray matter probably focuses on the whys a little more than Dwayne's research, because Dwayne, your research is literally just numbers based, right? It doesn't include any attitudinal, and we do look at a variety of attitudinal studies. We also look at some of the environment around us. Number one, giving across the board is down, not just among evangelicals, not just at churches, but if you look at data from Giving USA, virtually, in fact, I think every year for the past 20 years, there's been at least stability, if not a small increase, in the average amount, or the amount that the average person gives, the proportion who give. The proportion of Americans who give has been dropping. And then for the first time this year, in a long time, Giving USA, looking at all Americans, saw a decline in giving. So this is something that's happening nationwide. You can point to economic factors. Certainly, one of the things that affects our research, the first time we did this was literally in the height of the pandemic. Now, when the pandemic first broke, there was almost widespread panic within anybody that was donor supported, figuring, oh my goodness, we're going to have no money. Well, what actually happened is because of the inability to spend money at restaurants or at bars or at sporting events or whatever it may be, people had actually a lot more disposable income in some cases. Those who didn't suddenly got a lot of stimulus checks. And so there was also such a perceived and real need that giving actually rose during the pandemic. And so now it's falling back again. I mean, we have had significant inflation. We've had external economic factors. There's been political instability and things like that. So all of these factors go into it. We're also seeing a significant change in what donors want, what donors like, and what donors want to do as we look at different generations. Um, we, I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later in terms of some of the generational stuff, but there is a very substantial trend with donors and with people in general that today's young people become tomorrow's older people. And I don't just mean chronologically, that's obvious, but I mean they start to behave as they get older more like today's older people. So we have seen over and over and over again over the past 70 years, young people leave home, church attendance plummets. They're in their 20s, they're out trying to figure out who they are, they're starting their careers, they're dating, whatever it may be. Church is not a priority. They get married, maybe a little bit more of a priority. They have kids. Kids start asking, Daddy, what are angels? Or, whatever the questions are. And people start thinking, I am not prepared to answer this. Or they think, I had a good moral upbringing in church, so I want that for my kids. And so they would take them back to church. And we've seen that over and over and over and over. Giving has been traditionally the same kind of thing. There's a lot of evidence that that's not the case anymore. That today's younger people are not going to be the older donors of tomorrow the same way that today's older donors are giving money. And again, I think we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's also part of what it is today's younger people, as they're aging, are not replacing the donors who are dying off in the same kind of ways at the same kind of rate. So it's, as with many things, it's a variety of factors.
Yeah. So let's dig into that. I think this is a perfect segue to talk about the different kind of givers younger people are, what their preferences are, their trust level. There's so many different things that come into it. So go ahead and dig into that. Let us know, like, what are you finding is different about younger givers today and this projection that we had hoped would just kind of mimic what's happened in previous generations. And how is that going to be different going forward? What are your predictions? What are you seeing?
Well, about 3 years ago, I think it was, we worked again with Infinity Concepts and produced a report, the generation gap, and we looked at the desires, the interest of younger donors, donors of all ages, among evangelicals. So, just as kind of a brief overview, evangelical donors in general prefer giving domestically to overseas. They are more likely to trust an organization that they're unfamiliar with until it proves unworthy of their trust than they are to go into that already doubting the organization. They prefer giving to organizations they already know rather than learning about new organizations they might support. They prefer to support a small number of causes rather than a wide variety, and they prefer to support a small number of organizations rather than a wide variety. They prefer to research your organization before supporting it rather than just giving when it feels right. And they tend to plan their giving in advance instead of donating spur of the moment. That's the typical evangelical giver. And that population is dominated by people 50 plus, often by 60 and 70 plus.
Yep. You just
Even
described me.
oh, there we go. Evangelical don't, well, except for the 50 plus part.
No, I am 50 plus.
I was trying to be nice. Go with
I,
it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Evangelical donors under age 40 differ from their older donors in virtually every way. So, younger donors, unlike older donors, are more likely to prefer overseas giving than domestic giving. They're more open to giving beyond their local area than older donors are. They're less likely to start by trusting an organization. So they go into it already with doubts. They're almost as likely as older donors to want to learn. I'm sorry, they're almost as likely to want to learn about new organizations as they are to prefer supporting what's already familiar to them. They're much more likely to want to spread their money around to different causes and to spread their money around to a wide variety of organizations. And because on average they're giving less, that also means that not only is that same pool of money being spread to more organizations, but a smaller pool of money is being spread to more organizations. And they're almost as likely to give spur of the moment as they are to plan their giving in advance. So, complete sea change in what younger donors are doing, are interested in, are wanting. And think of, and again, I mentioned at the very outset, the big issue here is, okay, that's interesting. What do we do about it? And think about if these differences, if they maintain these differences as they age, and this generation, this younger generation, becomes the core donors out there in a few decades, we're talking about lower levels of donor loyalty to specific organization that will require stronger retention strategies. We're talking, it won't just be, hey, they gave last month, they're going to give again this month. There's going to have to be much more intentionality of let's make sure that they give again this month. There's going to be more need for variety and options within an organization to help hold their interest. There's going to be an even greater focus on emotional strategies and emotional messaging in prospecting and retention rather than just the rational and the logical. There's going to be an increased need for organizations to demonstrate, to overtly, proactively demonstrate trustworthiness rather than just assuming that donors will start by trusting them because they haven't done anything wrong. I mean, there's going to be more need for multiple touch points and for refreshed messaging to keep donors engaged. So, this is going to represent a sea change in how organizations, including churches, communicate with their donors, interact with their donors, connect with their donors, and get people to donate in the first place.
Yeah. I think one of the things that sticks out to me by this significant difference between one generation and the next, or the younger generation versus the older, is and statistic we know is that we've seen more money moving to nonprofits, and then so we've seen a decrease in the giving to churches relative to nonprofit giving. And the reason that is obviously is points to a lot of the things you've mentioned, Ron, which is that one, they're better at communicating the impact of what's happening rather than a church. And so that appeals obviously to younger people. And they're doing many times, there's a couple of organizations that we support that don't just do one thing, they do several things. They have a, they feed certain groups of kids in the area and nationwide. They do some sex trafficking. So there's other things that they're doing, and that gives the ability for a younger person to say, well, look at all the things they're doing, right? And so it's more. It sounds like it's more appealing to them that way, but also brings to mind the what I was thinking as you were talking about these stats is I think, at least for my generation, because we're so focused and the church leadership was so focused on helping people understand tithing, like literally what it meant and all of that, that created a steady basis of giving to the church. And there wasn't as much need for what you're talking about, which is the trust, the need for um, clear communications and keeping people giving from month to month and not assuming that they're just going to do it. So when you take the tithe factor out of it, then everything's changed. And I think that's a big significant difference why people give differently or younger people give because we really haven't been that great at upkeeping the terminology and the knowledge around tithing. I think most churches don't do that. In fact, I remember stating a research recently in a teaching about, I think it was Barna that did this research a few years ago of how many pastors don't believe that tithing is actually a New Testament practice. And again, if the pastors are confused about it, if they feel like it's not something that they want to stake their reputation on, so to speak, then how much more the people in the pew? They don't, they're hearing conflicting messages around it.
Well, there's another problem with the whole concept of, not the concept of tithing, but how tithing is communicated. I mean, literally, what does tithe mean? It's a reference to 10%. And so it's you give 10%, you give 10%, you give 10%. Well, here's the problem: people don't think in percentages. And so we did research 2018 just among the American donor population in general. And we asked them how much they give in two different ways. We asked them what proportion of their household income they give away. On average, and I don't remember the exact, but I'm within a few percentage points here. On average, they estimated 8.8%. Then we asked them how much money they give away. And we calculated the generosity according to what they told us was their household income. And it was around 1.6%, 1.9%, something. It was below 2%. So if you already are thinking, yeah, I give away 10%. I'm pretty close to 10%. If you're already at 9% in your own mind, okay, yeah, maybe I should drop another 20 in there and inch it up a notch. But basically, you're doing what you should. But when you look at it from a standpoint of dollars, they're nowhere close. And so you could raise the question, well, which one is right? Why isn't the percentage right? Why aren't people right on that? They're underestimating their dollars. It's because all the other research that's done by Giving USA, by other organizations, if you look at when 35% of Americans used to itemize their tax returns, those who did, we had exact data from the IRS on what they gave away. And it was right about what Giving USA shows. It was right about what our data shows. And it's nowhere close to that 8% or that almost 9%. And again, this wasn't even among people necessarily who believe in God at all, no less believe in tithing. And they're still estimating they're giving away almost 9%. So it's not, when pastors or teachers will talk about you need to give 10%. Well, you're talking to a group of people that on average thinks they're already there or pretty close to it. So instead of that, how about some worksheets on, okay, here's your household income. How much did you give? Huh, that's only 1.3%. What can we do to get that up to 1.5? What can we do to get that up to 2? And a gradual, a little bit of a reckoning of here's the reality, pal, but then also some encouragement of I only give 1.5%. How am I ever going to budget for 10%? It's just not realistic. So it'll never happen. Well, let's not budget for 10% right now. Let's budget for, it's like taking somebody who's 55 years old and saying, you should have $1 million saved for retirement. How much do you have? 40,000. Well, forget the million goal. They're going to look at it and say, I'm never going to get close, throw up their hands and walk away. Rather than say, can we get that to 50,000? Can we get that to 70,000? Right? And so I think a lot of the teaching on tithing, because of that focus on the percentage, has created a lot of this problem.
I think that's really good insight, Ron. And some of the things that I think about as you were talking, the number of options that someone has to give to increases every week. I think the Giving USA says the number of MPOs every week that's created is close to 1,000 new MPOs each week. And so you think about that, we live in the next generations are the Kickstarter and the GoFundMe folks. And we've actually had conversations with some people about what would it look like to say, hey, do a GoFundMe to fund your children's ministry. Just joking, but you would actually probably get way more interest in that than let me give to the general fund. Because at least when I talk to people in the next generations, they're not as interested in funding big buildings as they are in funding of movement. And so if you focus on the conversation about, hey, buildings and grounds is 40% of our budget, that's not going to get excitement. If you recognize that buildings and grounds is a core part of the creating a movement, so some of those conversations have to be thought of differently, because boomers like me, we just give because we're supposed to, and that's just a part of the journey. But the next generation is not the same way. And as we look at the stats that we identified in our annual report, looking at generational giving, Right now, it would take 10 Gen Zs or 3 millennials to replace one boomer's giving. And, that when you think about that, and we know that boomers are leaving the church probably faster than most any generation. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done in here. And then I also, as we're looking, and I look at a lot of churches' giving pages, and almost all of them are focused on how to do the transaction of giving. So they assume that giving is something that you're going to do as opposed to helping you. And Ron, I really appreciated the conversation about trustworthiness and transparency in even how we talk about giving, and even on the give pages or the giving pages, is recognize we have to help people start a journey towards giving. Most of them are not coming with the assumption that they're going to give. And so, how do we help them on that journey? How do we help them gain trust? How do we help them understand where their giving is going to, and how that is actually accomplishing a mission in a movement oriented perspective? And those are some of the things that I see that we as a church have got to stop looking at our give pages through the lens of Leo Sabo is going to come in and he wants one click to be able to do his giving. Leo's not the guy that we should be thinking through. We should be thinking about Leo's daughters and his grandkids. What's the conversation that they need to get started on a journey towards giving, not how to complete a transaction to give.
This episode of the Stewardship Leader podcast is sponsored by Mortarstone. Mortarstone is an innovative platform tailored for church leaders, offering strategic resources to cultivate a culture of generosity within church communities. It provides insights into giving patterns and member engagement, and enables church leaders to make informed decisions, personalize outreach, and nurture a spirit of giving. Mortarstone stands as a partner in ministry, transforming individual generosity into collective growth and meaningful impact for the church. For more information, connect with us online. Visit mortarstone.com.
Well, and just to follow up with what you're talking about, on 2 points, real quickly. We're in the process right now of doing a large study for a global ministry, and we presented potential donors, evangelicals who give money. We presented them with basically a cause. Here's the problem, here's the organization, here's what they want to do about it, and we're getting their feedback on it. And so far, the feedback has been very positive in terms of, wow, I had no idea this need was this great. But I was really struck as I was reading one comment. The person just wrote, "Great. Now another organization I have to prioritize in my giving." And that's where a lot of people are. Organizations talk about donor fatigue, as in, are we over communicating with our donors? Are we hitting them too often? What's really happening in donor fatigue is not that Global Christian Relief or Compassion International or World Concern is necessarily hitting their donors too often. It's that all of them and all of these other organizations, along with United Way and American Red Cross and Cancer Society and everybody else, is hitting the same people. And so it's not that any one organization is just blowing the doors off in terms of how much they ask, but it's that people are getting 10 of these things a day in their email inbox. And you were talking, Dwayne, you were talking about the younger donors with Kickstarter, et cetera. We did a study back in right before the pandemic started, right at the end of 2019 with Newport One, another agency, and we looked at a much broader picture of how people contribute. And I say contribute because it's not just give money; it's donate time. It's all these different factors. Compared to, just look at the two opposite ends of the spectrum, Generation Z and seniors. Compared to seniors, Generation Z is 28% less likely to have given to charities or ministries. They're 34% less likely to have given to congregations. They are 26% more likely to have helped out friends or family financially. They are 160% more likely to give something to a stranger in need. You can't afford those groceries? Here's $20 and I'll help you with them. You want a sandwich? I'll buy you a sandwich, whatever that may be. They're 162% more likely than seniors to give through crowdfunding. So right now, the patterns that they're building, even if these younger donors somehow magically do become like today's older donors, they may not be doing it through the same organizations. They may not be doing it through a World Vision or an American Cancer Society. They may be doing it through crowdfunding. They may not be doing it through the local church. They may be doing it to the people they see in their town or their own friends and family. So it's we're entering a very, very different world with the next generation.
Yeah, no doubt. And when I come across this kind of research and read it, and I am one of those persons who actually will read through the whole thing and try to figure out what does it all mean. And I got to tell you, most of the research that I've read over the last few years has been trending downward, meaning it's kind of upsetting to see it going in that direction. And I lament to some degree, but at the same time, I say, okay, so if this is the reality, and it is, and the research doesn't lie, then what do we do? Uh, what's going to be the giving landscape over the next 10 years and beyond? What are your thoughts on that, Ron? And Dave, Dwayne, please chime in as well.
Actually, I feel like I've been monopolizing things here. I'd love to hear Dwayne's thoughts. Give him a shot at it first, and then I can chime in if that's all right with you, Leo.
Of course.
So, Leo, at least when I look at the last 6 years of data that we've looked at, and if I project that out 10 years, there's multiple things that I see. One, we know that the silent and greatest generation, most of those givers are going to disappear, and they have funded a huge part of the ministry over the last years. Boomers continue to leave the church. Not necessarily, some of them are dying, but some of them are just leaving the church because they've moved to be closer to their grandkids and they've not got back into the habit of going to church. And we know from other research that church attendance is the biggest indicator of giving of anything. And so there's a lot of different factors that are there. The other thing that I see happening over the next 10 years in this space is we will see our Gen Zs and our millennials pick up in giving. I do believe that's going to be the case. But the question that is still on the table is, do they have the same income capacity and generation capacity of the older generations? And wealth is not something that I was reading a report the other day that the average age for home buyers is 35 right now. And so most of the younger generation are not even thinking about buying a house at this point in time. And so that's where wealth generation comes from. And that's where capacity comes from in some of these things. And so I see these next 10 years as a time where giving's going to look a whole lot different in the church if we do not step into the space of. And Ron, I really appreciated your comments about how to have the conversation about giving, moving from a 10% conversation into helping people understand real dollars. Because if we don't do that, I do believe the churches are going to be in a totally different perspective place than where they are today, because boomer giving is going to continue to drop. We've seen that over the last 6 years, and I believe it's going to continue to do that. We will see the other younger generations pick up. But if we do not step into this space and help people understand what it means to fully be sold out for Christ in this way, um, I think that we're going to start to continue to see the drops that Ron is talking about, but also probably in a church perspective, we'll see that pick up speed because boomers will have stopped giving to the churches. And I don't want to be doom and gloom, but that's kind of, if I've put together a spreadsheet based on data, and I appreciate Ron saying that I don't have all the emotional context that he does, but if I just put a simple spreadsheet together, the next 10 years looks a whole lot different for the church than what it does today.
Yeah, and on the doom and gloom side, I agree. I sometimes feel you know like I'm giving a constant cancer diagnosis here, right? But at the same time, if the doctor sees a spot on my lung in the X-ray, I want to know about it. I want to know about it so I can do something about it rather than saying, "Well, that nasty doctor gave me this bad news." So I think there are many, many different things that we need to talk about when we talk about where things are going over the next 10 years. And Dwayne mentioned the economic uncertainty for younger people. We've got medical debt for everybody is at all-time highs. We've got educational debt, which is at record highs. Those things factor into it quite a bit. Um, we also have the rise of the gig economy. And, people think of the gig economy as he drives for Uber Eats. Well, you know what? Every independent consultant out there, every voice artist, every tech person who takes a 18-month contract, every contractor, those are all in the gig economy. Right now, it's estimated that about a third of American adults are doing something in the gig economy, even either as their full-time job or as a supplement. And that's going to increase substantially, according to every projection I've seen. The gig economy has a lot of advantages. One of those is not economic security. When you don't know if your salary, if your income next month is going to be $500 or $5,000, you're a lot less likely to want to step out in faith and give stuff away. So that's another factor we have to take into account. And so that can also help when churches think about talking about finances, to think about practical matters such as budgeting for the gig economy. A lot of people out there aren't getting a day or a weekly or biweekly pay stub anymore. And even if they are, I think about my dad's time, or my grandfather's time. My grandfather, I think he worked for 3 companies his whole life. There are people now working for 3 companies in a week or in a day. So it's a totally different world out there. One of the things also that we need to think about a lot is when churches, especially when churches talk about money, they generally frame it through a lens of, I think I just mixed metaphors, but they generally look at it through a lens of stewardship. Well, we've been talking about stewardship in church for decades. And we still have, even among people who are giving to church, the average is, I believe it's 2.8% of household income going to church. So what we have found, Dwayne, you touched on this, we took it a little bit farther than just church attendance. Spiritual engagement, which is a measure that we use, not just a yes, no, but the frequency of church attendance, of Bible study, of Bible readership, of prayer, and of small group attendance. The more spiritually engaged someone is, the more every single measure goes up. The higher the likelihood they give to church and charity, the more generously they give, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe it's time to look at giving through a lens of discipleship rather than through a lens of stewardship. Because stewardship is basically saying you have a responsibility to tithe. You have a responsibility to give. It's a demand. Discipleship is when the person gradually or all at once or however it happens starts having a heart change and saying, look at what Jesus did for me. And all he's asking is this. And this can be read his word. This can be spend your time talking about him to others. This can be stewardship. But the more spiritually engaged people are, the more they give. The other point that I will make, Leo, you said something earlier that I will not dispute, but I want to give a nuance to, which is nonprofit giving instead of church giving. One of the things that we have seen for the past 20 years is that the more generously people give to church, the more generously they give to ministries and nonprofits outside of church. And the more generously they give to ministries and nonprofits outside of church, the more generously they give to church. So if one were cannibalizing the other, we would see inverse numbers. The more they give to church, the less they give to ministries, or vice versa. What we see is when people learn generosity, a rising tide lifts all boats. I have talked to so many pastors who don't want the Gideons in their church, who don't want to do a Compassion Sunday. They don't want to have missionaries come in, whatever that may be, because they're afraid it'll cannibalize. The truth is, that the more people give outside, the more people give inside, and vice versa. And so maybe it's time to also think about how can churches and parachurch ministries work together. And also, and I don't have empirical evidence for this, but it's a logical leap to the next statement, which is it possible that one mistake leaders, whether it's in NPOs, nonprofits, or churches, are making is when they teach about stewardship, the focus is on here's why you should give to us. When you do that, it's a very self-serving message. And that's one of the reasons why you'll hear congregants complain about pastors or churches being greedy, etc. How many pastors say you need to give? You need to, and if you don't want to do it to us, I'd love to know why, but go do it to Kids Alive. Go do it to Voice of the Martyrs. Go do it to the local food bank, but do it. And when people hear that, it's a very different message than here's why you need to support us, here's why you need to give to us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's just what that communicates is that it's the giving isn't about us getting your money. It's not a self-serving um, endeavor or approach. It's, hey, we know that giving is something that will bring joy, fulfillment to your life, and we don't want you to miss out. So give to our church. If you find this family and what we do here worthwhile and you want to invest in it, then yes, we want you to give here. And here's what we're going to do with it. But don't stop there, right? I mean, that's a completely different message than make sure you give to us before you give to anyone else. And then not having a church, being part of a church that's not bringing in the other ministries and nonprofits that are doing good work that the church isn't doing. Well, what does that say to the congregation member? It's all about us. It's all about our family. We don't really care about the world. We care about us. And that's a anti-kingdom of God message, and people won't gravitate to that. So I couldn't agree more, and it's so well put, because it is about just discipleship. And I so appreciate, Ron, that you boiled it down to that. Yes, we talk about stewardship. Heck, our organization is Christian Stewardship Network. But what's true about what we do and what we constantly connect with pastors and talk about is that this is not a money thing. This is a discipleship thing. It's a heart thing, and it's about helping people understand what Jesus has done for them so that they can reciprocate and engage that relationship fully with their money, with their talents, with everything. And I love the fact that you brought that about, because ultimately what changes people's hearts is not whether we can phrase things in a perfect way. It's about helping them connect to the why, the real why, which is the grace that's been given and the gift that's been given to all of us, and that's salvation and redemption. So thank you both for so much for everything you've done. I know that we could go on and on. There's so much more. One thing I would like to emphasize is I know that we cited a couple of different reports that you, Ron, have been involved in. Of course, Dwayne, you and Morderstone have done the report. Um, with your permission, I'd like for us to be able to link those to the notes in this podcast so that people can um, access them and read through them and learn everything you guys have been saying about that. Is that good?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
That's great.
Perfect. Okay. Any last words? Anything else you want to share before we close today? Thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate it.
Well, Leo, I know the one piece that Ron also did was a study on lapse givers. And Ron, if there's one thing that people could walk out of here with regarding lapse givers to MPOs, and then we can attach that to the church, I think that would be awesome to hear as well.
I think probably that there are a number of things that I could talk about with that, but I think one of the things that is very applicable to churches as well as to ministries is that there's a huge, huge difference between satisfaction and loyalty. I think about the cars that I've owned. I've owned Buick, Eagle, Mitsubishi, Mercedes, Lexus, Audi. I have never bought the same brand of car twice. I've been highly satisfied with all the cars I've owned. I have not been loyal to any of those brands. And when we look at people who lapse, who stop giving to a ministry, they are largely satisfied with the fact that they're getting timely gift receipts, they're being thanked appropriately, the organization is doing business ethically, etc. But here's what's missing. They don't have the loyalty, and they don't have the connection. So, for instance, of the lapsed donors, 90 of the lapsed donors we spoke with, 90% feel very strongly. They understand the mission of the organization that they stop supporting. 87% feel passionate about the cause that that ministry addresses. So it's not like they've suddenly decided, I don't want to spread Bibles to the world, or I don't want to help persecuted Christians. What's missing is the connection. 37% don't feel close to the ministry. And then 45% don't feel strongly involved in helping the ministry accomplish its goals. So they understand and strongly support what the ministry is doing, but they don't feel connected to it. And so that's one of the things with churches. People can be very satisfied. Pastor's interesting, church is comfortable, I like the music. Are they really engaged? Is it really a place that is challenging them? Do they want to be challenged? That's a we talk about what churches need. That's also a very much what Christians need is do they want to be challenged? But does the church also work to create that desire to be challenged spiritually, to be challenged in their lifestyle? So there's a lot of lack of connection with churches, especially when it comes to money. The average person has no clue what a church's finances are like, how a church budget is determined, what a pastor gets paid or should get paid, what it costs to maintain the building. They have no clue. They have no clue how a nonprofit is run or funded. The best example I can think of, years ago, I was attending an evangelical Presbyterian church that was really struggling financially. And one day we walk in and there's a new welcome center built in the lobby. And I went to the pastor and said, what in the world? You're telling us that you're going to have to take a pay cut, that the church may not survive, blah, blah, blah. And we get this. He says, well, but somebody came to me and said, we need a welcome center. I will pay for it. I said, that's fine. Everybody walking in today is going to have the same exact response that I had. And nobody is going to ask you about it. And so they will all look at that and say, oh, yeah, sure, the church is really struggling. How much did that thing cost? Communicate, communicate, communicate.
Yeah, I mean, you just dropped a gold nugget there, because so much of what we assume to be proper communication is not communicated, or it's either not communicated at all, or it's communicated in the wrong way. We actually say things that communicate things we don't want them to take as truth. And that's a perfect example of how people in the church look at their giving. They do want to see a church that's, I know personally as a giver at my church, I want to see that it's stewarded well, right? That's important to me, because if I'm a steward, I would expect that spiritual leaders would be good stewards of what's been entrusted to them. No, I'm not going to control it. I'm not going to tell them what to do with it. But I am going to gauge whether I'm part of that congregation, whether I'm going to be a continuing giver, whether that's being done well or not. And not knowing, yeah, I'm older. I tend to trust before I'm proven otherwise. But that's not the case with younger people. And this is why I think we're seeing so many of these stats, is that lapsed givers are receiving communication that we don't intend to communicate, but we do. And yeah, proper communication, what you just said, Ron, is so important. I hope that listeners, our pastors especially, are hearing that and really can walk away from this really thinking, what are we communicating? How do we do a better job of it? And maybe you have to be. In fact, I can't see anything wrong with being more transparent. I don't think you can be too transparent. You can definitely be vague, but you can't be too transparent. And I think that's such an important part for churches to understand.
Well, so many churches, the only time they really talk about church finances is in the quarterly elders meeting, which 98% of the congregation won't attend. So your church needs money for a particular ministry. Why? What are you going to do with it? Or is it just this big budget that everybody looks at the building and says, well, it's a nice building. I guess that's what it's going to pay for. Pastor just bought a new minivan for his family. I guess that's what I paid for. But they're not seeing what their money is actually going to accomplish.
And that goes back to the transparency conversation we had earlier. But I think the other piece that is true, as Ron was talking about, that what actually connects people to the church. It's the discipleship pieces that Ron talked about earlier. What's it look like for you to be involved in a small group, to be involved in weekly worship, to be involved in regular Bible study? All those things is what connects people to a church and creates a strong relationship to the church. And so we're still back to the conversation that discipleship matters in this conversation, and discipling people towards giving, but also it creates attachment. And the more they become attached, the more they become committed. And, it's often the times of, does our treasure precede our heart, or does our heart precede our treasure? And I think it can be a both and conversation. And so how do we connect the heart more deeply into the lifeblood of the church, which then begins to be a core step forward in all these areas.
And I think there's one additional point, hopefully we have a little bit of time for it, that I think is really critical for pastors. This is not just the clergy's job. The most important, and I've done a lot of research over the years, the most important gift or ability that a pastor can have is leadership. If the pastor is the only one talking about the importance of giving, is the only one talking about what the church needs, how the church is using its money, it's just one more burden. It's just one more burden for an already overburdened role. The most effective pastor is going to be the one who can select, train, motivate, and coach others to be conveying that message. And it's not just a message about the finances, it's a message about discipleship. It's a message about, hey, how are you doing in your prayer life? Church, church is community, ideally. And community is not all about the mayor telling everybody what to do. Community is all the neighbors working together.
Well, so appreciate both of you, the work that you're doing, everything you've shared. And I know we can certainly keep going. There's so much more here, but I appreciate the what you guys do because it helps us to understand what's happening, at least to a degree that puts us on notice to say, hey, this is going in a direction none of us want. And if we're not changing the way we're communicating, if we're not changing the way we're approaching this, not as a transaction between us and the people in our church, but truly a transaction between them and God, that it is a discipleship issue. So I just want to thank you both for what you do. We appreciate it. It is definitely work that at least the community that I'm part of here at CSN really appreciates knowing this information because it does truly help us to think about and communicate differently about giving, about stewardship, about discipleship, because this is a bigger issue than just money. Money is just it's a revealer. It reveals things that are, it either helps us to accomplish things or keeps us from it. But it really is, I think, the research and the information you guys are digging up and finding through this research really does help us to see something. And I hope it is my hope that it helps us to turn the tide. That at some point in the future, the things that we're seeing will not actually happen. That giving will eventually begin to come up, and that younger generations will pick up that. But I don't think it's going to happen naturally. I think it's going to take leadership stepping in and doing exactly what you just said, Ron, which is to lead others and to make it something that we all talk about. It's not just a need for the church; that is something that we all need. That giving is part of our life as followers of Christ. Well, thank you again for being part of this. I so appreciate both of your time. Thank you, and our community thanks you for everything that you're doing.
It was great to be here.
Thanks, Leo.
And thank you for listening to this podcast. I so appreciate you taking the time and listening. If you enjoyed it, please give us a review on whatever platform you listen to. But also, more importantly, share it with someone. Share it with a pastor. If your church is not aware of our ministry, let your leadership know that we exist and they can take advantage of some of the content that we're producing, like this podcast. If you want to know more about what Ron's doing, go to graymatterresearch.com.
Gray Matter Research, and Gray's with an E, not an A. graymatterresearch.com, no S.
Perfect. All right. So please check out his organization, everything they're doing. And of course, mortarstone.com is one of our partners. And you guys are, if you're not aware of what they're doing, please check out their report. I'm going to link all of that in the notes of this podcast. So please take advantage of this information. This is something that I think will really help you to get a deeper understanding of what's going on in the giving and help you move forward in your own communication on this topic. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time on Stewardship Leader.